All right, it's 2 minutes past the hour, so I think we should start. First of all, just a very, very warm welcome to David McNair, who's Global Policy Director of the One campaign, and a former colleague, so declaring that interest, and someone I respect greatly. And we've invited David today to talk about something that he's been active on Twitter and articles with, talking about this particular Hinge moment that we're at, with various different crises all coming together. We have had COVID, we still have COVID, as many of us firmly will advocate for. It is not over, and I've seen that in your email, David, so I know you are aligned. There's also the terrible Ukraine conflict, impending food crises, food crisis, fuel crisis, cost of living crises across the world. So we're at a Hinge moment. So could you explain a little bit more about how you approach this, David, and how you're thinking about this, and what you think maybe some of the opportunities are here, as well as this sort of very difficult moment that we're facing? Over to you.
Thanks, Elle, and thanks for inviting me. It's great to see so many familiar faces and to be part of the PAN network, which one is an active member of and has huge respect for. So a Hinge moment, what is it? Well, I mean, if you look back across history, major crises tend to lead to much needed reform, and sometimes not the reforms that you might expect. So the Black Plague led to daughters being granted land rights for the first time. A cholera epidemic in London in 1854 spurred action to address London's so-called Great Stink that led to the sewer system that's still in London today. World War I led to the League of Nations, which is now the United Nations. World War II led to the creation of the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank. And it's clear that with all these kind of crises piling up, we're kind of living through something of a similar scale. It's different, but the question is whether these crises are big enough to prompt a rethink in how we manage global affairs. Because I think it's clear to a lot of us that these institutions that we have, that were created, 70, maybe 100 years ago, are not fit for purpose in the world that we live in. And a big part of that is the fact that we have these transnational threats, whether it be pandemics or disinformation or climate change. But the way that our institutions tend to think about it, even if they're international institutions, they're governed on a national basis. So we have threats that don't respect borders, but that governance is driven by national interests. And the areas that are kind of where we desperately need cooperation are increasingly being weaponized, actually, by those national interests. And I'll come on to that in a little bit later. But first, I should say, whenever the COVID pandemic started, I kind of thought, okay, this is like, we've never had anything as big as this in my lifetime. This is our moment to rethink and fix all these problems that we've kind of been fighting for reform for a long time. And I convened a lot of very smart people. I think you were on that group, Eloise, to kind of figure out, okay, well, what are our ideas? How do we get in front of Joe Biden if he's elected? This was before he was elected. And the group kind of laughed at my naivety, because they were like, of course those reforms need to happen, but this is not that kind of moment. The post-World War II kind of Bretton Woods moment was, basically the winners of World War II coming together to say, let's make sure that this doesn't happen again. And we're in a situation now where governance and power is, dramatically fragmented. There are no winners, and actually increasingly there's kind of more and more tension in the system. So even if you were to convene a big conference to redesign the whole architecture, who would you invite? Who would you not invite? If you didn't invite them, not having them in the tent might be a problem. It's just kind of a very, very different time. I think the kind of thing that we need to kind of ask ourselves is, given we absolutely need these reforms to deal with these transnational threats like pandemics and climate, but we're not in the moment where we can do the same thing. What are the kind of specific things that we can do that are achievable in a 6-month or year or 2-year time period that kind of meet the scale of the need, but don't require us to rethink everything in a way that is never going to make progress, or we can never make a deal between the key parties. And I think we need to get to that specificity, but we also need to kind of paint this broader vision of the world that we want to see. And maybe I can talk a little bit about that later, but hopefully that answers a bit of your question, Eloise.
It does, and thank you for that. What you prompted in my mind as you were speaking, and as I think about this broad historical pattern where bad things lead to good reforms, I wonder if one of the challenges we face is that while COVID-19 is universally accepted as having been, and it is still a bad thing, we haven't really had that admission of guilt or winners and losers, I don't think, at least, and I'd be interested in your view, institutionally, whether it's governments, whether it's companies, whether it's agencies, because what's happened is, as we know, many governments have fared rather differently in this crisis, whether it's in terms of economic impact, in terms of lives lost. But some of that has already faded away, because I can think of examples where they maybe did terribly in terms of lives lost and short memories in terms of the vaccine rollout going better. I think, there are obvious countries that spring to mind. So how do we brand this as a bad thing when, yes, COVID-19 is accepted as a bad thing, but have we got the institutional kind of blame game? Is there any of that going on that actually leads to the kind of depth of feeling you need to lead people to say this can't happen again, therefore we need to reform? So just a small question, batting that back to you.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And it's I mean, there have been some efforts to say, well, this was, China's fault or whatever it might be. But I think what has been clear, if you look at the difference between the response to COVID and the response to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, like the way that the latter has united NATO and the transatlantic alliance and so on, it's clear that when we have like a kind of enemy that we can see and we can point to and we can demonize, and that's a kind of traditional threat in terms of bombs and invasions and so on, we kind of rapidly come together, change, decades of foreign policy, mobilize billions of dollars. Whereas if you've got these kind of like more amorphous threats where there isn't someone to blame, but actually they're more insidious, we just don't have the means to cooperate or the sense of urgency around that. And I think the problem, part of the problem with COVID was that it was managed domestically as a kind of national problem, and the people who had power to make decisions were kind of responding to domestic audiences, when actually this is a kind of national security thing. And the international response was kind of like, okay, well, let's make a few pledges, this is a kind of charitable endeavor to help poor countries, rather than it being seen as actually this is about the security and stability of our societies, our economies, and potentially deaths of millions and millions of people. So I think we need to move from like, as kind of advocates and people who kind of drive this agenda, it's very easy for us to kind of box ourselves into like, okay, we're the development people, we work on global health, we know how to do a replenishment, let's do it. When actually we need to kind of completely reframe how we think about these things, and that applies to pandemics. I think it applies to climate, but it also applies to cybersecurity and disinformation, because increasingly, I mean, as you saw with vaccines, as we're now seeing with food, nefarious actors in the system are going to weaponize those things to serve their own national interests. And unless we have a way of kind of managing and responding to that, then we're kind of like, we're at the table, we're trying to get everyone to cooperate, while there are other people thinking about these things as weapons of war. And that's a very, like, you just can't, you need to find a different way of thinking about it.
So what would be your suggestion then for those different ways of thinking about these issues? How do we go from our own policy advocacy, business as usual? You mentioned replenishments, you hinted at silos. What are the kind of big reforms of the scale of Bretton Woods that you would like to see happen if you're dreaming big and nothing's wrong in a brainstorm.
Well, I think before we get that to there, I think it would be good to kind of take a step back and just think about how much the world has changed since 2015, when you and I were in New York and the Sustainable Development Goals were agreed and so on. I mean, since then, we've had a migration crisis in Europe, Eurozone crisis, Brexit, Trump, China becoming more influential and increasingly authoritarian. You have Saudi Arabia blatantly, flouting international law in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. We've had the pandemic. We've had crises that are largely ignored in Yemen and Ethiopia. The US admitting defeat in Afghanistan. The invasion of Ukraine. We're potentially heading into a global recession. So, I mean, the world is entirely different from even 5-7 years ago. So kind of our kind of thinking that made our work so successful in that era is like we're just in a completely different era. And in thinking about why this is, I kind of think about it in terms of 3 layers. The first is kind of interests and values. Previously we were operating in a rules-based order. We agreed on international treaties, and by and large we, respected them. And there was outrage when we didn't. You think back to the reaction against the war in Iraq, for example. But I think the problem is that the countries that previously upheld those norms are increasingly actively flaunting them. And that's even in some cases being seen as a kind of political win for them. I mean, you saw that during the time that Trump was US president. So the big players are prioritizing their own national interests over their values. And other countries are coming and saying, well, we see this hypocrisy, and hang on a minute, because you're telling us to do all this stuff, but you're not doing it yourself. So is that values and interests question? The second layer is China, which is fundamentally important in terms of now being a major international player, militarily, in terms of trade, access to finance, and so on. So there's kind of like an alternative, non-democratic model that some countries are saying, well, we can develop like this. China's lifted 1 billion people out of poverty. So that might be a model that we want to follow. And then we've also got, China with a kind of very comprehensive strategy for building its influence through the Belt and Road Initiative, which in early 2020 had lent $4 trillion. So you got this comparison with China, long-term strategy, major, provider of infrastructure finance. And then you've got the World Bank and the IMF that are just, a little bit more piecemeal. They move slower. They kind of preach a lot more. They have a lot more conditions. So there's this kind of like, balance where a lot of countries are saying, well, who do we don't even want to have to side with one or another. We want to be able to like access all of this. And then the third layer is, the fact that everything is being weaponized. Because we live in an increasingly interconnected world, we're dependent on one another. And we've seen everything from chip shortages in Taiwan, driving up the cost of cars, to, all the stuff that we've worked on vaccines. So governments can weaponize these things rather than using traditional warfare. And that's extended, everything from, the SWIFT network, which became, very well known during the early days of Putin's invasion. But, that's happened for a long time, with the US Treasury pushing for sanctions on Iran, and, sanctions on individuals and so on. But there's also, ways in which trade tariffs, food, disinformation, even migrants are being weaponized to destabilize other countries. And that's, I think, the way that Putin is kind of playing his game. It's less of a kind of Chinese kind of let's build our economic influence, and more how do we kind of use these new tools to destabilize our enemies. So in that regard, like the rules are just entirely different. And I think what we need to do is kind of think through, what are the kind of specific things that will attract countries, attract people to a values-based approach, which is basically what the SDGs are basically a kind of values-based approach to, every life has equal worth. We need to fight hunger and climate change and all those things. And I think part of that is the countries that espouse those values, living up to them and leading by example. But the other part of this is kind of making clear that we need to provide a long-term strategy and a plan that meets with these challenges. And piecemeal kind of initiatives announced at every G7 that aren't part of a long-term strategy just aren't going to kind of, be enough to respond and build resilience against climate and pandemics and so on. So then the question, and this gets to the question that you asked, so it's a very large, very long introduction, but I think it's clear we need a lot more finance. And it's clear that the multilateral development banks are underutilized in that regard. They're, the World Bank's moving too slow. It's got this AAA credit rating, which it could use to borrow, potentially $1 trillion more on capital markets, and it's not doing that. So I think there's something quite specific there that we could do that's technical enough to not get snarled up in multilateral politics, but actually could yield, financing on the scale that we need. And I think we need to be thinking much more ambitious about, the kinds of deals that will yield hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars, rather than kind of in the mindset of, well, we've got this set pot of ODA, so we need to keep defending it. The second is around who sits at the table. And I think there's increasing voices from Africa saying, if you look at, the G20, if you look at the World Bank and IMF, there are decisions being made that affect our future where we don't have a seat at the table. So I think there's a lot that needs to be done there. There's an IMF governance review coming up in 2023. There are increasing calls for an African Union seat at the G20. But there are also some quite specific things. One of the things that many of our partners are working on is the cost of capital and borrowing for low-income countries and middle-income countries. And a big part of that is the way that they are evaluated by the credit rating agencies. Which are these agencies? There are three major players, which are private entities, and they evaluate the credit worthiness of countries and therefore, how much it costs them to borrow. And there's an increasing feeling that there's a kind of risk premium placed on African countries, particularly because, they're African, or, there's just a kind of methodological challenge with that. And that's something that Macky Sall, the current chair of the AU, has been kind of very vocal on. So I think there are issues like that, like how can we make sure that there's a fair representation, seats at the table, and that these kind of technical issues that affect, effectively the cost of money and therefore, the cost of everything for low-income countries can be addressed.
That's great. I'm gonna sort of power us up towards the big solutions that you're gonna pepper us with, and talk on the way about the intersecting priorities that we have when we think about pandemic preparedness and response, and our desire to push pandemics beyond the health agenda because it affects every aspect of society, of government, as we've just seen. So how do you think we need to think about the institutions that help us govern or fund or deal with these issues, especially for modern threats when we're thinking about disinformation, cybersecurity, climate change, pandemics? How do we, on the one hand, be good advocates and have our very specific asks that are easy for policymakers to understand, but yet weave together and push part of a broader and necessary narrative about the bigger changes that need to happen within which these smaller changes sit?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is kind of telling a story about the world that we want to live in. And I think often we kind of box ourselves into thinking, okay, well, here's the kind of political frame in which we sit. And this kind of slightly contradicts what I said before in terms of getting to what's actually realistic. But I think we need to think in terms of almost like radical incrementalism. We need to have a radical vision, but we need to then break it down into the kind of steps every 6 months that we can kind of drive forward that are specific and get us to that broader vision. But I think telling that broader story is really important. And if you look at the history of neoliberalism, back in the kind of 1940s and 50s, going back to Hayek, what until quite recently has been seen as like the economic norms were quite a radical, extreme idea. And what a lot of right-wing philanthropists did was that they kind of put a lot of money into normalizing those ideas by funding academics, funding think tanks, even funding church groups that kind of, made those ideas kind of in some way normal. And then whenever the kind of economic downturn of the 1970s happened, then there was kind of primed, fertile ground for Reagan and Thatcher to come in and kind of reform everything. So I think we need to be thinking about that, like what's our kind of overall vision, and then how can we push for those incremental things that kind of get us there? Because that, neoliberalism kind of ideology is an ideology, and it's a kind of way of thinking that was intentionally embedded in, future finance ministers as they kind of trained in universities and all the rest. So I think that's the first thing. And then in terms of the institutions, I think a big part of what we need to do is think about resilience. If we're in a world where there are going to be increasingly frequent shocks of increasing severity, then investing in our resilience, makes sense for whatever shock might come along. So thinking about global public goods and investing in those so that there's pots of money ready to be deployed as soon as something happens, rather than, having to, arrange pledging events to try and get money. I mean, with the ACT accelerator, we're still trying to get the money, 2 years into the pandemic. Whereas, in the next pandemic, I think what we should be doing is kind of saying there's already, $100 billion or whatever there ready to be deployed. And, potentially that could be in a form that isn't all public money, but is, there could be other forms of capital there. But then we need the kind of the norms and the sense of kind of teeth and sanctions to be able to ensure that people are, that governments are, conducting, surveillance, they are sharing information, and that they are kind of in some way both encouraged and discouraged to do the right and the wrong thing.
Thank you. Super interesting. And so I picked up on this radical incrementalism you talked about. So if we're talking about bigger, more visionary change that we want to achieve, when so many leaders are playing a sort of smaller, incremental, small game, how do you think we shift the political calculus? You've mentioned about telling the story about the world we want to live in, embedding and normalizing norms and sanctions, and then picking up on some of these tactics that were used, in the last century, even about how to normalize new ideas. But it'd be great to get your views on how you think we get from from small incrementalism to radical incrementalism, beyond those things you've mentioned. And do you think there are some of those big ideas? What if neoliberalism was the big idea that was seen as radical and normalized? What are the equivalents today? Do they exist, or do we need to put more time and effort into creating them?
I mean, I think we do need to put more time and effort into creating them and finding messages that kind of cut through. But I think the risk, I mean, part of the challenge in the way that the media works and social media works, and the access to data that we have, is that we're kind of constantly following polling data and kind of what we think is viable. And I think we need to do that to be smart, but we also need to kind of have this broader vision. And the idea, for example, that during a pandemic, that medicines should be available to everyone, no matter of their ability to pay, because that's the best way to end a pandemic. That shouldn't be a radical idea, but it seems to be a radical idea, and I think we need to find ways of kind of normalizing even simple things like that, and getting more and more people to kind of buy into that idea and ask the questions about why that doesn't exist, and then you can get into the technical discussions as well. It's about IP, it's about funding of the R&D, it's about resilience and capability to roll out and so on. But sometimes I feel that we're kind of just jumping into, a sense of kind of outrage that these things aren't happening, whenever we haven't brought people along with us in terms of, them agreeing that we should live in a world where these things shouldn't happen, you know. So I think thinking about kind of telling those stories and telling stories about increasing inequalities and how we can, you know, somehow untangle those and address those is fundamentally important. Then you can get into the discussions about education and economic productivity and trade policy and all the rest. Because what's happening now is that I think even within, you know, OECD countries, those who are left behind by globalization are rightly angry and are kind of buying into populist ideas. Whenever actually the things that might be in their interests are, you know, more fundamental structural reforms to how we govern our economies and, you know, our taxation systems and so on. So I think there's a broader story that we need to tell and kind of situate, you know, pandemic preparedness or climate resilience into that. You know, shouldn't we want to live in a world where the next pandemic doesn't lead to 2 years of lockdowns and 13 trillion cost to the global economy? But people, you know, I just don't think people are thinking that way. They're thinking in the short term of like, okay, how do we get beyond this and then move to the next thing?
That's a really good point. And I think it also applies to advocates as well. And our own norms can be very culturally specific as well, depending on where you grew up in the world. Some of these ideas are radical and some of them, for some people, they're not at all. And I think maybe we need to do a better job of addressing that, breaking that down and sort of facing it head on when it comes to healthcare, for example, universal access, things like that. In some places, that's radical. In others, it's like a no-brainer. And so I take what you say there. Really good point. I'd like to start opening up to questions from the audience. Could you please put your hand up if you have a question? David, if you'd like to contribute to the debates. I see Neil. Neil, the floor is yours.
Thank you. This is such a great conversation. I apologize, I'm not on camera right now. And I guess my question is, at the start of the conversation, you gave all these great examples of how catastrophes from the plague in Europe to World War I or World War II led to these monumental changes in law or creation of multilateral institutions, et cetera. But I think the difference between now versus those other catastrophes that the world went through is that there wasn't as much of a threat of disinformation and misinformation as we have now. Certainly, like in the 20th century, right, there was a lot more access to information than in prior centuries, but information was filtered through reliable institutions, right? Newspapers, et cetera. Whereas right now we have social media and rampant spread of misinformation and disinformation. So my question is, how can we overcome that threat of misinformation and disinformation, which I think limits our ability to make changes? And I guess the last thing before I turn it over to you is, you know, for me, in the United States, for example, we've had 1 million people die of COVID, which is more than in any other war, if I understand correctly from a recent quote from Tom Frieden. Yet Americans are not up in arms about what we've lost here in the United States, and obviously throughout the world. So again, I guess my question is, you know, we have a difference now between other catastrophes, which I think is related to misinformation and disinformation. And what are your thoughts on overcoming that? Thank you.
Thanks, Neil. I mean, I'm no expert, but I know it's a problem that needs to be addressed. And you know, it's entirely relevant to pandemic response. You know, I recently heard from a colleague that, you know, a big driver of the vaccine hesitancy in some African countries is, you know, the fact that Russia is basically trying to, you know, undermine trust in the West through undermining the credibility of, you know, Western vaccines and saying, you know, funding Facebook ads that basically say if you take Pfizer you'll get a heart attack or whatever it might be. So I think, you know, they seem like tangential issues, but actually they're fundamentally important to what we're working on. So I don't claim to have the answers. I mean, I know that there's, lots that can be done with technology, with regulation. And some of my colleagues at the Carnegie Endowment are doing a lot of really interesting work on understanding the drivers of this and the amplifiers of disinformation voices. But I think it's a very, very difficult thing, because then you get into kind of the issues of both freedom of speech, but then the fact that governments, including in Africa, are using crackdowns on social media to control information. So it's an incredibly difficult challenge to address. But unless we grapple with that alongside all the other issues that we're working with in terms of medical supply and all those kinds of things, then we're not going to be effective in solving these challenges.
Thanks, David. Does anybody else want to come in? There's the chat's going lively. There's a question from Mike in there, Mike Podmore, about global public investment as a critical idea and approach we should build on. Can you speak to how an idea like this might be instrumental as a narrative and a set of clear changes that are needed? And then he goes on to talk about integrating them both in the pandemic fund, the fifth, and then also how to connect the dots between that and the pandemic accord and the future of Act A. Do you want to take that chunky one first, and then we'll get to the other?
Sure. I mean, I think the whole kind of the premise behind this idea is that you're kind of moving from a charitable model where rich countries are saying, okay, we'll transfer some money to poorer countries, to saying, okay, here are transnational threats that we all need to grapple with together. Therefore, everyone should pay in, and everyone should have access to that capital whenever there's a crisis. And of course, that was, in a sense, the kind of beautiful idea behind Act A, and then the kind of powerful countries undermined that through what they did with the supply and purchase agreements and so on. But I think in principle it really matters, because it's about all of us coming together to tackle threats. And if you have a virus that's growing in a poor country, that's still a threat to those in a rich country, and vice versa. So kind of moving beyond the kind of this whole kind of aid charitable model towards global solidarity with one another to tackle these problems is, in principle, the right way to do it. In practice, I think it's a real challenge, because those who are paying the most money inevitably have the most power. And I think finding ways of kind of upending that will be really important. There are some discussions which I find really, really interesting about the role of data in disease surveillance, and particularly the role of the depth of African medical data and the richness of the DNA pool that could be a resource for disease prevention and surveillance globally. So considering that form of capital alongside financial capital could potentially even those things up. But I think it's absolutely the way that we should be going in principle. The question is whether we can make it work in the realpolitik of imbalances of the amount of money being put into these funds.
Thanks, David. Just before we leave that, Mike, did you want to add anything on that question or comment?
Thanks, Eloise. Obviously, I worked with David previously on this, and continuing, our engagement on the fifth is sort of critical, because it's at these moments that we've got this opportunity to shift the norms, and it's mobilizing sort of immediately now all of us around that particular opportunity. And what that means is, just in terms of the governance structure of that fifth, for example, is ensuring that low and middle income countries are at the table and have a vote, and that civil society and communities are at the table and have a vote. And if we establish that norm, which is not a new one, that is already established in previous, existing mechanisms, then we start to create, that is the expectation of the value-based system and world that we want. And so I think, I agree with David that, that radical incrementalism is really critical, but it's sort of like, what are the opportunities right now, and being clear and really pushing consistently on the same couple of messages that will then, what are the big ones? And I would say that sort of involvement at the table of decision making is one of the critical ones, not the only one. But also, yeah, and as you highlighted, where the funding is coming from, etc. And then where it's going to. So and I think this broader narrative, that's the last point, is just around sort of the nature and the future of multilateralism is really critical. And we need to have a narrative there that's both a bulwark against some of the narrative, like with the International Development Strategy in the UK, where they're sort of saying, we'll have more focus on bilateral and less on multilateral, to sort of compete against China. But actually, that's not the way. The way is through multilateralism, but a multilateralism that works for everyone. So I think that's really important. One of the things I wanted to sort of flag in, as I was just in a discussion last week, it was a bit alarming to me around some of the discussions around multilateral stakeholder initiatives. And there was a whole group of civil society and communities who were sort of saying, hey, we need to get rid of these multilateral multi-stakeholder initiatives because they're being co-opted. And I think there are sort of real valid examples of where that's happening in the food sector and things like that. But of course, in health, actually, it's been hugely beneficial, largely, not completely. But it's an engagement. There's a whole other groups of civil society that are having a whole different narrative. And I think when we're talking about multilateralism and sort of what that looks like, we need to make sure we're reaching across to all the different sectors. Anyway, just a flag. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. There's a good comment / challenge or question from Jamie in the chat. I don't know if Jamie wants to come in. I was particularly taken by the third point that we're all failing to get our argument to market. Jamie, I don't know if you want to come in.
Hi there. And I slightly hesitate in my comment because I obviously missed the beginning of David's fine words. So David, you may have covered some of this. And you both, David and Eloise, and many others in this call have been brilliant participants in the Sharing Strategies calls and network from inception. So thank you for all of your thought leadership in that process. And all I'm doing is reflecting back, sort of in a sense, what you've and others have come to conclusions on in that process. But it's just worth spelling out for everyone. First of all, cleared shared financing ambition between climate and development groups is essential. It does not today exist. This isn't a problem in the world out there. This is very much a problem in the way many of our organizations are currently set up. So this is something in our gift to solve. And I think it's also important that while we try and solve the problems in the world out there, we look at our own organizations and how we're organized. And that is one where we have to nail it. Climate and development do not belong in silos anymore. They must be integrated when it comes to considering the situation of developing countries, the opportunities they face to access sustainable finance for green jobs, and the threats they face for obvious reasons. And until that changes, so many other problems are not going to get solved because we're going to be split unnecessarily by ourselves. That's job one. Job two, then that's about the big money and the trillions and leveraging the multilateral development banks and the global financial institutions, public and private. We won't get there if we're separated as development and climate apart. The second one is about implementation. That's work stream 2. There's so much exciting innovation there, which not all partners know about sort of digital platforms for delivery, the application of data. The fabled data revolution is finally really turning up in some places, and the advent of a lot of challenge to our sectors about locally led development, which is really overdue and really fantastic. And put that together with lots of things we've known about open government for a very long time. And we have a great agenda that will encourage the sectors to implement together. And then in the third work stream, which is about politics, which is the most difficult and most important, none of us can succeed to the adequate level until we've got better regulated social media. And it's not something that development organizations think it is their job to work on. It is somebody else's problem. It is not. We have to understand it as a development problem. It's a deep kind of modern governance problem. And again, because of the way we're all mandated, missioned, and funded, we don't want to take on some of these really difficult problems. And I think we have to together find a way to do so. So, from COVID misinformation to climate misinformation and disinformation to misogyny to Putin fueling anti-democracy everywhere, poorly regulated social media is a common culprit and needs attention from us all, or we all fall and fail together because our political operating environments in all of our key markets, it's just too hard. So I just think that's something that we sort of shy from, including myself, right? Because it's so bloody hard, but we've got to get a grip on it. So across those three areas, those three work streams, there's a clear conclusions from the processes that many of us are part of. And I really, I'm excited about working, with you, David, and Eloise, and everyone on this call on that kind of agenda. David, I agree with pretty much all of your analysis. So the question is, like, what are we going to do? I'm very excited about GPI, but it's a good example of something that has zero chance of succeeding until we've worked out something on work stream 3 that creates the space for the political leaders who want to do that kind of thing to succeed. So it's essential technocratic piece of thinking. We should do some good pilots with FIF and so on, but it won't get to scale until we've done some of the work on the politics and the political leadership front under the sort of work stream 3 kind of category. I do think in lots of our kinds of conversations, we glide between what's a financing question, what's an implementing question in countries, and what's a political question, and sort of merge them together. And then we sort of turn it into a policy technocratic question because so many of us are more comfortable with that, when in fact it's a political question. So I'm not saying anything that people don't know on this call, but I just thought it's good. Eloise, great that you've organised this call.
Thank you. It's our monthly-ish virtual stage where we spotlight a key practitioner, thinker, someone with something to say. And before David comes in on your comments, I just wanted to add a footnote to your point on social media regulation. Perhaps maybe regulation in general outside of the health development box is something that needs to be looked at more broadly. Some of the bigger achievements that I've been involved with in my career were to do with ministries, DGs of a completely different nature. For example, the Transparency Directive regulating the oil, gas and mining industry. So sometimes it takes going elsewhere, perhaps to make change in our own sphere. So David, some reflections on what Jamie said, and then a couple of great questions in the chat as well. So I'll bring you to those in a second.
Thanks, El. Yeah, I mean, on the shared financing agenda, I mean, it's clear that, what we've got now is a kind of piling up of needs and crises, and lots of people going after the same pots of money. So we need to kind of completely reform that and just think through, telling a story about the resilience of our societies and the kinds of threats that we face, and therefore the kinds of capital that needs mobilized. We saw how much money could be found to kind of shore up and protect Western economies. It was something in the region of 18% of GDP in 2020. So, if that's something that can happen in response to a virus like COVID, why can't we be spending a lot less on preparing on that resilience? And that, needs to be both, all kinds of threats and all kinds of resilience. So it again speaks to the kind of us getting out of this kind of siloed approach where education people are competing with health people, competing with climate people for the same pots of money. It needs a complete reframing. But I also think that, there is a risk that we kind of go out again and again with how much this will cost, rather than the world that we want to see and what we need to invest in that world. If things are seen as a cost, then it's perceived psychologically in a very different way from, investing in kind of tangible things that will protect what we love or the future that we want to create. And then on points 2 and 3, I think that's absolutely right. I think it kind of speaks the kind of co-delivery and localization issues speak to the need to mobilize constituencies in their local context that can take action in their own daily lives, but also have solidarity with other people in other places who are also taking action. So it again breaks down this idea of, charity or kind of rich people helping poor people. And that's where, a lot of the most interesting things are happening. the way in which the mayor of Freetown in Sierra Leone, Yvonne Haki Sawyer, has kind of used her platform to do very, very specific things on vaccinating dogs to address rabies, addressing, collecting of rainwater so you got fresh. All those kinds of things are the real things that kind of affect people's lives and are tangible. So I think getting to that local level rather than these academic, international processes and kind of big numbers of the number of people going hungry and so on, that's important, but it needs to be connected with the local. And then on the political case, I think that's absolutely fundamentally important. But I think we need to go upstream a little bit rather than just saying, okay, we've got this government here, what can we get out of them? I think we need to go upstream and kind of start telling a story about, what would it take? How can we shape the political ideas to build this world that we want to see? And I think it's been quite inspiring to see how that has been done. The way that the climate movement effectively shaped the European election, European parliamentary elections, was kind of, I think it's the first time that I can think of where a civil society movement that I've been kind of connected to has, shaped electoral politics rather than just shaping a kind of niche policy within that governmental context. And of course, European parliamentary elections aren't, the big time, but it shows that it can be done and it should be done in other places,
Oh, I don't know. They have half a say on regulation for 27 countries. I would beg to differ. I would bring your attention to two different but actually connected questions in the chat from Nina and David. Nina asks about definitions of pandemic preparedness, and also why aren't we thinking about the broader frame of what's needed in a response, for example, schooling. And David relatedly says, perhaps could you speak to labour migration to the UK, and are we going to achieve pandemic preparedness without taking into account such trends as labour migration? So two different angles to basically, what do we mean by pandemic preparedness and what should we mean? This is a big question for us at the Pandemic Action Network, and obviously the sort of health security framing of detection is critical, and all the work around the IHRs, and pandemic readiness to respond is the sort of more, how do you prepare health systems? But it'd be great to, and David's meaning around healthcare workers in particular, he's just clarified in the chat. Would you like to come in on those before maybe Nina or David? Do you want to tell it in your own words at all, verbally?
No, it's a good summary. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just say that on the schooling, which is very sort of micro in a way, but we know that when we have a new pandemic, and if it's an infectious disease, kids are not going to be able to go to school, and we know that that has a massive lag effect on everything development. And yet there is so little attention to that issue, and it's just not part of the dialogue or discussion. So David and Eloise, I'm wondering, do you have ideas about how, I understand in the chat this sort of dilemma between, there's a limited pool, but back to the world that we want. How do we put some of those sort of mitigation strategies for our mitigation strategies already on the thinking agenda, or maybe they're there and I'm just sort of missing it? Thanks.
And maybe I could just add on my piece, David, just was that, I don't know if you saw the FT piece this week about labor migration of nurses in particular from Commonwealth countries to the UK, well, and more broadly. WHO was making the point that as a result of Brexit, that the UK was in a place where where it's pulling or incentivizing workers coming from Commonwealth countries as opposed to from European sources. And it was really striking recently too. The health minister of Zimbabwe made an appeal for compensation, for the health workers, the nurses in particular, leaving his country for the UK, and asking for $100 million in compensation. So I think that those are some interesting trends. I'm not sure that our our conversation on pandemic preparedness is really taking the scale of the human resource problem we're facing into account. So I don't know if you can comment on that or relate it to what you're talking about.
Thanks, Nina, and thanks, David. So, I mean, on Nina's point, I mean, I think there's a broader question about like how we define pandemics, or how we define a scale of shocks. And whenever there's a particular trigger point hit, there should be certain things that kind of are kicked in that help us respond to those shocks. And that there might be something on education, there might be something on intellectual property for medicines in that particular scenario. You know, there might be something on, you know, fiscal stability, or, you know, the way in which the IMF treats countries. But I mean, what we saw in COVID was that we're kind of like, everyone was kind of scrambling around trying to figure a solution in real time. Whereas if we had those, you know, agreements in place and then things that automatically happened, the speed at which we could move would just, you know, mean that we kind of avoid so much, you know, loss of life and loss of education, loss of economic productivity, and so on. So I think that's kind of the way that we should be thinking. And of course, the devil will be in the detail on that, and there will be lots of lobbyists to kind of water down those standards and so on. But I think that's partly what we should be thinking about in terms of like building a baseline of resilience, and then these kind of trigger points whenever shocks happen, and defining. I mean, I think it would be worth thinking about how we define different types of shocks, rather than, you know, having a pandemic track that's completely divorced from a climate track or a fiscal stability track or whatever it might be. You know, learning from what happened with the financial crisis and the Financial Stability Board and so on, and applying that to health stability might be quite a helpful thing to do. And, you know, developing common norms or principles that apply across the board. In terms of health migration, I mean, there is some work that's happening as part of the Africa Europe Foundation, which is this group that's kind of advising on, you know, the EU AU partnership in terms of, you know, issues of brain drain and kind of how we kind of invest in health worker capacity. I mean, I think the first thing to say, and, you know, I think most people on this call will know more about this than I do, but, you know, the key challenge in the rollout and response of the you know, vaccines and pandemics has been the lack of, you know, healthcare infrastructure, whether that be, you know, human infrastructure or physical infrastructure to be able to do that. So building resilience should be like the kind of baseline should be that we have that infrastructure in place. But then thinking about, you know, how, you know, if we're kind of in a beggar than neighbor approach where, you know, some countries that can pay more kind of, you know, resulting in brain drain from other countries, that's something that needs to be addressed or compensated in the kind of training and capability process. And, you know, it's almost like any scarce resource, whether it be vaccines or, you know, fertilizer at the moment, or health workers whenever they're in scarce supply, and then the highest bidder can make the case for those. And we need to find ways of protecting the basic needs of vulnerable countries within that.
Great, thank you. And I wanted to draw your attention to Kenneth's question as well in the chat about global interventions at country level and advice on getting leaders more focused on pandemic preparedness or allocating resources for pandemic interventions. And then there's some more kind of chats going on. So if you could just give a really quick response to that one, and then I will try to wrap up.
Thanks, Elle, and thanks, Kenneth. I mean, I think that the challenge for, you know, decision makers in vulnerable countries at the moment is that there are just so many crises and, you know, limited resources to respond to those crises. So if you look at the difference in the economic support packages, if you look at the IMF data in 2020, for advanced economies, it was about 18% of GDP. For low-income countries, it was about 2% of GDP. And it's basically because they didn't have the ability or the fiscal space to print money and be able to kind of respond to the crisis as it was then. Now we've got, you know, piled on top of that, massive energy inflation, massive food price inflation. I mean, the cost of importing wheat for Benin, for Egypt, has doubled in the past 3 months. So, I mean, I think we can do all we want. We can kind of make the case all we want that this is important, but if you're in a limited pot of resources and a sense of scarcity, then you're going to need to prioritize. And what we need to think about is kind of beyond that. So how can we make sure that the richer countries that pledged their special drawing rights more than a year ago deliver on those? I mean, there was 100 billion pledged, 40 billion has been actually pledged, 0 has been actually delivered. And that's a year later in the context of a crisis. So I think part of what we need to do is think about how we kind of, prioritize increasing fiscal space for countries that are facing debt crises, energy, food price crises, all these other things. Pandemic preparedness is like, 7 or maybe 10 on the list. And that's the broader question. As George W. Bush once said, make the pie higher. And we need to think beyond our existing envelopes.
Thank you so much, David. And I'm just going to reflect some of the things that I heard from you that we can take away with us today. You said to us that we need a lot more finance from MDBs, that's underutilized. That's somewhere we can think about as we try to raise our ambition. We need to think more about who sits at the table, change those norms, and we need to think about the cost of capital and borrowing as a sort of big overarching theme as well. We need to tell a better story about the world we want to live in so that we're not just stuck in our silos or with our tactics, but getting towards the North Star we need to aim towards and bringing people along with us there. We need to be radical. If we are going to be incremental, we need to have radical incrementalism. And we need to have new norms and even sanctions to help us embed this broader, bolder vision. And I think you've given us loads of food for thought today, lots to think about, and some really good ways in which we can take this work forward and think about our connectivity across different issues, but also in the way that we show up every day and question our own definitions, how we want to get from A to B. And maybe sometimes the best route is not the most direct route. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today. Thanks to everybody in the chat for the rich discussion and for the audience for brilliant, brilliant inputs. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did, and have a lovely morning, day, evening.
Thanks, everyone. And if you want to follow up, I'm on Twitter and LinkedIn and so on. And you should sign up for our email, weekly email, one.org/aftershocks as well. Thanks, everyone.